They didn't suddenly respect you. That's the lie people tell themselves when perception finally catches up. They say something changed because admitting the truth is uncomfortable. The truth is that nothing new appeared, nothing evolved, nothing emerged late. What changed was their ability to keep ignoring what had always been there for a long time. They looked at you through shortcuts, labels, assumptions, roles that made their world simpler. You didn't fit cleanly, so they compressed you into something manageable. Quiet became passive, stillness became uncertainty, precision became hesitation. That misread wasn't accidental, it was convenient. Seeing you accurately would have required them to slow down, to pay attention, to question how they evaluate people in the first place. Most don't do that. They move fast. They scan surfaces. They reward noise. And because you didn't announce yourself, you were easy to overlook. Not invisible. Overlooked. There's a difference. Invisible things can't disrupt a system. Overlooked things eventually do. While they were busy interpreting volume as value, you were operating from consistency. While they were reacting to moments, you were maintaining position. You didn't push for recognition. You didn't correct their misunderstanding. You didn't compete for clarity. You let time do what pressure never could. You stayed the same, while their frameworks aged. And frameworks always gave way before reality does. The moment they finally saw what was already there wasn't dramatic. There was no apology, no announcement, just a quiet recalibration. They stopped speaking to you the same way, stopped assuming access, stopped filling silence around you. Because once perception corrects, behavior follows immediately. They didn't suddenly see potential. They saw limit, the limit of what worked on you, the limit of their influence, the limit of their old assumptions. And that's when everything shifted. Not because you changed, but because they could no longer afford to misread you. Once that recalibration started, it spread faster than they expected. Perception doesn't correct gradually. It snaps into place the moment the old explanation gave way completely. People began replaying earlier moments with new context. Things you said that didn't land at the time. Decisions you made that seemed neutral but now felt deliberate. Silences that once looked empty, now read as finished. They realized how often they had mistaken your restraint for uncertainty, because restraint doesn't feed their need for confirmation. You weren't waiting for permission. You were already aligned, and alignment doesn't advertise itself. It holds. The more they watched without projecting, the clearer it became that you weren't operating on the same incentives they were. Praise didn't pull you. Pressure didn't accelerate you. Dismissal didn't provoke you. That absence of reaction wasn't detachment. It was completeness. People who are incomplete negotiate constantly. They explain, they defend, they adjust. You didn't. And once that distinction became visible, it changed how every interaction felt. Conversations slowed. Words were chosen more carefully. People stopped improvising around you because improvisation assumes influence. They sensed that influence didn't work here. Not through emotion, not through urgency, not through authority. What they finally saw was not some hidden ambition or secret plan. It was structure. Internal structure that didn't depend on external reinforcement. You weren't managing perception. You were beyond it. And when someone is beyond perception, perception adapts. They no longer tried to define you, because definition requires access. They no longer tested boundaries, because boundaries weren't declared, they were implied. Implied boundaries are stronger than imposed ones, because they don't invite challenge. And here's when the first crack appeared in their confidence. That project, the one everyone said needed immediate action. Urgent meetings, heightened urgency, demands for your input. You didn't show up to the first 3. When you finally appeared, you spoke once. This isn't ready. They ignored you, pushed forward anyway. 3 weeks later, everything gave way exactly where you said it would. You didn't say, "I told you so." You didn't need to. That silence said everything. And that's when respect replaced curiosity, not admiration. Respect. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but alters behavior automatically. You felt it in the room. The way conversations paused when you entered. The way people chose words more carefully before speaking. The way assumptions faded before they formed. You didn't demand this shift. Your consistency demanded it for you. And consistency is something people can fake their way around. Either you have it or you don't. You had it. They didn't. But here's what most people miss about moments like these. Recognition doesn't feel like victory when it finally arrives. It feels like relief. Relief that you don't have to prove anything anymore. Relief that the performance is over. Relief that you can finally exist without translation. They stopped asking you to explain your decisions, stopped questioning your timing, stopped observing whether your stillness was strategy or uncertainty. And this is where something unexpected started happening. People started changing how they behaved, even when you weren't in the room. That meeting you missed, the one where they had to decide without you. Someone said, "What would they do?" Not as a joke, as a genuine question. Your framework had become their reference point. Your standards had become their measurement. You weren't there to guide anything, but your absence shaped it anyway. Because real influence doesn't require presence. It requires pattern, and you'd established one they couldn't unsee. You weren't leading the space. You were anchoring it. And here's the difference. Leadership requires direction. Anchoring requires weight. You had weight, the kind that accumulates through consistency, not performance, through precision, not volume, through being exactly who you were in every context without adjustment. That kind of weight doesn't announce itself. It settles. And once it settles, everything else organizes around it. And that quiet, stabilizing presence is your mastery. But what came next surprised even you. They started protecting your time before you had to. Don't bring that to them yet. Wait until it's actually ready. They don't deal with half-formed ideas. You never said any of this. They created the filter themselves. Because watching you operate taught them something uncomfortable. Most of what they did was negotiable. Most of their urgency was performative. Most of their motion was compensation for lack of clarity. You didn't compensate. You clarified. And clarity unsettles people who've built routines on confusion. That efficiency unsettled people who were used to stretching interactions to maintain influence. You weren't cold. You were exact. And exactness exposes waste. They saw how much filler they relied on, how many words they used to say nothing, how often they confused activity with progress. You spoke in finished thoughts, moved in complete actions, existed in resolved states. No loose ends, no emotional debris, no need for follow-up. That completeness made their incompleteness visible, and nobody enjoys seeing their own inefficiency reflected. This is where their perception fully corrected. Not in a moment, in a series of small realizations that compounded. You weren't distant. You were self-contained. You weren't unpredictable. You were consistent without performance. You weren't unavailable. You were complete. And completeness doesn't require validation to remain stable. But here's what they couldn't articulate yet. Here's what was still forming in the back of their minds, waiting to surface. That moment in the meeting when someone tried to urge you into deciding. Everyone watching, expectations elevated, timeline tight. They pushed. We need an answer now. You didn't blink. You'll have one when it's ready. 20 seconds of silence. Nobody moved. Then the meeting continued without resolution. 1 week later, you delivered the decision. It was right. It held. Everyone who pushed forgot they pushed, but they remembered the silence. They remembered that urgency doesn't accelerate you. It reveals them. You didn't become central by demanding it. You became central because nothing worked unless it accounted for you first. That's the shift most people never see coming. You didn't insert yourself into their plans. They started building their plans around whether you'd support them, not because you had authority, because you had accuracy. And accuracy carries more weight than authority. Authority can be questioned. Accuracy simply holds, and that structural position is yours alone. And here's the quiet truth nobody wants to admit. Once they saw you clearly, they also saw themselves clearly. And most people don't enjoy that reflection. They realized how often they performed instead of produced, how often they spoke to fill space instead of add value, how often they moved to feel busy instead of make progress. You didn't judge them for it. You didn't need to. Your presence was the reflection. Your consistency was the mirror. And mirrors don't distort. They just show. People plan differently when a constant is present, not because the constant demands it, because reality does. You became that constant, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. And here's what happened as that reality settled in. Something shifted that most people don't notice until it's already lasting. The questions stopped, the observations ended, the probing dissolved, not because you shut it down, because it became unnecessary. And what followed that realization was something they didn't expect. The difference is that now their perception caught up to reality. And when perception aligns with reality, nothing dramatic follows. There's no celebration, no vindication speech, no moment where you get to say finally. There's just a quiet settling, a recalibration. They finally saw what was already there, and once they did, the need to look any closer disappeared. The dynamic didn't intensify. It's simplification. And simplification is always the sign that understanding is complete. There's no curiosity left to satisfy, no mystery left to decode. People don't keep analyzing what no longer changes. They simply adjust and move on. You become part of how they orient themselves, not something they question, not someone they evaluate, just a fixed reference they account for before acting. That's the quiet consequence of being seen clearly. You don't gain attention. Interactions lose resistance. Expectations become shorter. Communication becomes cleaner. Assumptions fall away before they form. Not because you corrected anyone, but because reality did. You didn't arrive louder. You didn't assert control. You didn't demand recognition. You stayed intact long enough for distortion to wear out on its own. And once it did, what remained was undeniable. You were never misunderstood because you were unclear. You were misunderstood because they weren't looking properly. Now they are. And now there's nothing left to say. The version of you they once interacted with doesn't exist anymore. Not because you changed, but because it never existed to begin with. It was their projection. And those projections dissolve the moment accuracy replaces them. From here forward, the dynamic doesn't progress. It stabilizes. You're no longer interpreted. You're accounted for. And that is the final shift. That stability seals it. When someone is finally seen without distortion, there's no energy left for revision. People don't circle back to reinterpret you. They don't reopen old narratives. They don't test whether the conclusion still holds. Accuracy doesn't require maintenance. It becomes the baseline. From that point on, your presence stops being a question and starts being a condition. A condition doesn't ask permission. It doesn't seek agreement. It's simply accounted for. People plan differently. They speak more precisely. They stop trying to extract meaning where there is none to extract. Not because you resist them, but because resistance implies engagement. Your past engagement. Your past explanation. Your past needing to be framed correctly. What they finally saw was not something new emerging, but something consistent that refused to bend for convenience. And consistency at that level ends speculation completely. There's no upside in guessing, no reward in probing, no advantage in misreading. The environment adjusts and remains adjusted. That's why the change doesn't feel dramatic. It feels settled, like something that should have been obvious earlier, but couldn't be recognized until the noise wore itself out. You didn't step into visibility. Visibility stepped out of your way. And once that happens, nothing intensifies. Nothing follows. There's no aftermath to manage. The story doesn't continue because it no longer needs to. You were always there. They just finally caught up. And that final catching up doesn't create momentum. It creates stillness. The kind that doesn't invite reaction because nothing needs correcting anymore. People don't try to reinterpret you once accuracy becomes fixed. They don't seek confirmation. They don't look for exceptions. They adjust once and move forward. That's how you know it's complete. Not because anyone said it out loud, but because behavior stopped fluctuating. You're no longer approached as an idea, a possibility, or a question mark. You're approached as a fact. Facts don't argue with opinions, they replace them. This is why the dynamic doesn't reappear in new forms. No renewed curiosity. No delayed challenge. No quiet attempt to reclaim influence. Influence only exists where uncertainty lives, and uncertainty is gone. You didn't become distant. You became precise enough that distance stopped mattering. You didn't withdraw. You resolved. And resolution removes the need for follow-up. What remains is orientation. People know what won't work. They know what doesn't apply. They know where effort is wasted. That understanding shapes behavior more reliably than any explanation ever could. You don't carry this as an identity. You don't maintain it through effort. It maintains itself because it isn't performative. It's structural. And structures don't need applause. They need time to be noticed, and nothing more. They finally saw what was already there, and when they did, the search ended. Not with excitement, with clarity. And clarity doesn't extend the story, it brings it to rest. This is the last layer, the one that rarely gets discussed because it doesn't feel dramatic enough to stand out. After accuracy settles, even memory shifts. People no longer remember you as a sequence of moments. They remember you as a standard, a quiet reference that reshapes how they assess everything else afterward. What once impressed them now feels thin. What once distracted them now feels loud. What once confused them now feels obvious. Not because you taught them anything, but because seeing you correctly recalibrated their internal scale. That effect doesn't reverse. You don't remain present as a story. You remain as orientation. From that point forward, you don't need to arrive early or leave late to have impact. Your influence isn't tied to presence. It's tied to the absence of distortion. People move more cleanly after crossing your path, even if they never speak to you again. They don't trace it back consciously. They just notice that certain approaches feel ineffective now. Certain behaviors feel exposed. Certain shortcuts no longer satisfy. That's how you know the understanding is complete. Nothing needs reinforcement. Nothing needs protection. There is no version of the past they can return to where misreading you feels comfortable. You didn't rise. You didn't transform. You didn't reveal some hidden self. You simply remained intact until perception corrected itself. And once that correction settles, it doesn't loosen. It doesn't echo. It doesn't intensify. It fades into the background and guides quietly. They finally saw what was already there. And after that, there is no sequel. Because what follows clarity is not more insight, it's alignment. And alignment doesn't speak. It simply stays. And that is the settled state. Not evolution, not transformation, not becoming, just remaining. You didn't change. They did. Their perception corrected, their behavior adjusted, their understanding aligned. And once alignment happens, nothing more needs to be said. The story doesn't continue, because stories require tension. There is no tension left, just recognition, just accuracy, just a quiet acceptance that what was always there has finally been seen. And that is where it rests. Not with applause, with stillness.